You know what's strange about pain? You spend so long thinking it owns you that you forget it has an expiration date. You wake up expecting the same weight on your chest, the same memories, the same disappointment waiting for you like it paid rent in your mind. But then one day nothing. You look back at the thing that used to destroy you, and it doesn't have the same power anymore. That's the moment nobody prepares you for, because healing doesn't always feel like fireworks. Sometimes it feels almost insulting, quiet, ordinary. You just realize you're not checking their name anymore. You're not replaying what happened. You're not begging the past to become something different. You're not asking, why me? You've finally reached the point where the answer doesn't matter. And congratulations, it's over. Not because the past suddenly became beautiful. Not because what happened was fair. Not because you forgot the pain. It's over because you stopped giving yesterday permission to control today. There was a version of you that needed closure, needed explanations, needed somebody to admit they were wrong, needed the world to understand what you survived. But that version of you is disappearing. You learned something brutal. Sometimes closure is nothing more than deciding you're finished carrying a story that already ended. And now the same things that once broke your focus can't even hold your attention. The same words that used to keep you awake don't hit the same. The same people you thought you couldn't live without became lessons you learned to live beyond. That isn't weakness. That is what happens when you finally become stronger than the thing that hurt you. So don't go searching for the pain just because you're used to feeling it. Don't reopen doors just to prove you've healed. Don't confuse familiarity with love. Don't mistake an old wound for an unfinished story. You survived it. You outgrew it. And now you're standing in a place where the past can knock all at once. But you don't have to answer. There was a time when your pain had a schedule. It knew exactly when to show up. Late at night, in the quiet moments, when everyone else was asleep and you finally had nowhere to hide from your own thoughts. It knew which memory to replay, which sentence to repeat, which face to bring back into your mind. And you let it. Not because you were weak, but because pain can become familiar. Strange, isn't it? You can hate something and still become addicted to its presence. You can spend years trying to escape a feeling while secretly building your entire identity around surviving it. But eventually, something changes. You wake up one morning and realize the thing that used to control your emotions doesn't have the same authority anymore. That person can still exist. That memory can still exist. What happened can still be real. But it doesn't own you anymore. And that distinction changes everything. You don't need to pretend it never hurt. You don't need to rewrite history and call betrayal a blessing or heartbreak a beautiful experience. Some things are ugly. Some people disappoint you. Some moments leave scars. That's life. The trick isn't convincing yourself that the pain was good. The trick is realizing that you don't have to keep paying for something that already happened. Think about how much energy you used to waste fighting the past, replaying conversations like you were going to discover a secret answer hidden between the words, imagining what you should have said, wondering what would have happened if you had acted differently. Building entire alternate realities inside your head where everything somehow makes sense. And for what? The past doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how many times you revisit it. You can stare at yesterday until your eyes bleed, and yesterday will still refuse to become tomorrow. At some point, you have to become bored with your own suffering, not disrespectful toward it, not careless about what happened. Just tired of giving it the starring role in a life that is supposed to belong to you. Because pain loves attention, it whispers, remember this. It says, don't trust again. It tells you, stay angry, stay guarded, stay exactly where you are. And if you listen long enough, you start calling your prison a personality. But you are not your worst day. You are not the betrayal. You are not the rejection. You are not the person who walked away. You are not the mistake you made when you didn't know what you know now. Those things happen to you, but they don't get to become the definition of you. There comes a strange moment when you realize you're no longer waiting for an apology. You're no longer checking whether someone regrets losing you. You're no longer trying to prove that they were wrong about your worth. You simply stop caring. And that kind of freedom is almost uncomfortable at first because your mind has been trained to chase answers. Suddenly, there is nothing left to chase. You start noticing small things. You laugh without forcing it. You sleep without replaying old conversations. You hear a song that used to destroy you and it becomes just a song. You see a familiar place and instead of feeling crushed, you keep walking. That's how you know the power is gone. Not because you forgot, but because remembering no longer commands your behavior. And don't expect some dramatic transformation. Real strength is often painfully quiet. Nobody applauds when you stop checking the past. Nobody gives you a trophy for choosing peace over revenge. Nobody sees the moment you decide not to send that message, not to explain yourself again, not to reopen a door that nearly destroyed you. But you see it. And somewhere inside that decision, you begin taking pieces of yourself back. The person who hurt you may never understand what they did. They may never apologize. They may never even realize how much you changed because of it. And that's fine. Your freedom cannot depend on their awareness. If they need to understand your pain before you're allowed to move forward, then they're still holding the key. So take the key back. Let them misunderstand. Let the past stay unfinished in their mind. Let people remember you however they want. You don't have to correct every version of yourself that exists inside somebody else's head. Your job now is different. Your job is to build a life that doesn't require you to constantly look over your shoulder at what happened. Because the most powerful thing you can do with pain isn't worship it, isn't hide from it, and isn't pretend it never existed. It's to become someone it can no longer control, someone who can remember everything and still choose where to go next. Someone who can look directly at the chapter that once destroyed them and simply realize that the chapter is still there, but the person reading it has changed. You know what's dangerous about an old wound? Sometimes it doesn't hurt anymore, but you keep touching it just to make sure it's still there. Strange, isn't it? You can finally escape something and then spend your own energy walking back toward it. You tell yourself you're looking for closure, an explanation, one final conversation, one last answer. But sometimes you're not looking for closure at all. Sometimes you're looking for something familiar because peace feels unfamiliar. You've spent so long living with chaos that silence starts making you uncomfortable. You've spent so long expecting disappointment that kindness makes you suspicious. You've spent so long preparing for someone to leave that you start pushing people away before they even get the chance to stay. And then you call it protection. Clever little trick, isn't it? The mind can turn fear into logic if you let it. But protecting yourself from yesterday can quietly destroy tomorrow. You don't have to keep reopening the same wound just because it reminds you of what happened. You don't have to reread old messages. You don't have to revisit old places. You don't have to stalk memories like they're going to suddenly confess something they refused to tell you before. The answer you're searching for may not be hiding in the past. Maybe the answer is simply that it happened, it hurt, and now it's finished. And finished doesn't mean meaningless. It means you don't have to keep bleeding to prove that it mattered. There are people who become so attached to their pain that they don't know who they are without it. They introduce themselves through what happened to them. They carry betrayal like a badge. They carry rejection like evidence. They carry anger like armor. And after a while, they don't even realize the armor has become heavier than the wound ever was. You don't need to become cold to become strong. You don't need to hate everyone who hurt you. You don't need revenge. Revenge keeps you emotionally connected to the person you're trying to escape. Imagine that. They walk away, but you keep carrying them around in your head, giving them free space in your thoughts while pretending you've moved on. That's not freedom. Freedom is when they can exist somewhere in the world without occupying a room inside your mind. You stop checking. You stop wondering. You stop creating imaginary conversations where you finally say the perfect thing. You stop rehearsing your revenge speech in the shower, like you're preparing for the greatest courtroom drama nobody asked to attend. You realize that winning isn't making them regret losing you. Winning is reaching a point where you don't need them to regret anything. That's when the wound starts losing its identity. And yes, there will be moments when the past tries to crawl back into your head. A smell, a song, a photograph, a random sentence, something small can unlock an entire room you thought you had burned down. But you don't have to walk inside. You can notice the memory without becoming the memory. You can feel something without obeying it. That's maturity nobody talks about. You don't have to react to every emotion simply because it appears. Anger can knock without getting invited inside. Sadness can sit beside you without driving the car. Nostalgia can whisper without becoming your future. You can acknowledge what you feel and still choose what you do next. Because healing isn't the absence of memories. Healing is the absence of control. One day you'll realize you haven't thought about it in weeks, then months, and when it finally crosses your mind again, you won't feel the need to investigate it. You'll just think, that happened, and continue with your day. No dramatic music, no explosion, no grand announcement. Just a quiet realization that something which once controlled your entire emotional world has become nothing more than a memory passing through. And that's the moment you understand why reopening the wound was never necessary. You weren't proving that you cared. You were keeping yourself attached to something that had already ended. So stop touching what you've already survived. Stop checking whether it still hurts. Stop returning to the door that taught you why you had to leave. Some chapters don't need another conversation. Some people don't deserve another explanation. Some memories don't need to be destroyed. They simply need to lose their position of power. Let the past keep its scars. You keep your future. Closure sounds beautiful, doesn't it? Almost like a little box you can put everything painful inside, lock it, and finally walk away. But here's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes the person who hurt you is the last person capable of giving you peace. You keep waiting for an explanation from someone who benefited from your confusion. You keep expecting an apology from someone who never had the courage to admit what they did. You keep imagining that one perfect conversation where they finally understand your pain, finally confess everything, finally say the words you've been waiting years to hear. And while you're waiting for them to give you freedom, you don't notice that you've handed them the keys. That's the joke. You think you're waiting for closure, but you're actually waiting for permission to move on. And why should someone who damaged your peace be responsible for restoring it? Why should the person who broke the window get to decide when you stop standing in the cold? You gave them enough power already. Don't give them the final word too. Maybe they will apologize someday. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll understand what they did when they're older. Maybe they'll never understand it at all. Maybe they'll tell their version of the story and make themselves the hero. Let them. People have an incredible talent for rewriting history when the truth makes them uncomfortable. You don't have to chase every false story with a correction. Your reality doesn't become less real because somebody refuses to acknowledge it. There was probably a time when you wanted them to regret losing you. You wanted them to look back and realize they made the biggest mistake of their life. You imagine them seeing your success and suddenly understanding what they threw away. It feels good for a moment, doesn't it? But there's a trap hiding inside that fantasy. You're still making your future about them. You're still asking, will they see me now? That's not freedom. That's performing for an audience that may not even be watching. The real victory is much quieter. You wake up and don't care whether they know what you became. You build without announcing it. You heal without explaining it. You improve without sending progress reports to people who doubted you. You stop trying to make your life into evidence for somebody else's courtroom, because your life is not a courtroom. You don't need to prove that you were right. You don't need to prove that they were wrong. You don't need to gather witnesses, screenshots, memories, or arguments and present them to the universe like you're waiting for a verdict. Sometimes the verdict is simply this: you're still here and you're moving forward. That's enough. People often confuse closure with understanding. They think if they can just understand why someone betrayed them, why someone left, why someone lied, why someone changed, then everything will finally make sense. But humans aren't equations. Sometimes there is no satisfying explanation. Sometimes the answer is disappointingly simple. They made a choice. It was their choice. It hurt you. And you don't have to spend the next 10 years turning it into a mystery. You can accept that some questions don't deserve your entire life. There is a strange freedom in saying, I may never know. I may never know why they did it. I may never know what they were thinking. I may never receive the apology I deserved. I may never get the conversation I imagined. And I'm still going to live. That's power. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that needs an audience. The kind that quietly removes someone's name from the list of people who control your emotional weather. Because when you stop needing closure from the person who hurt you, something changes inside you. You stop checking your phone. You stop hoping for a message. You stop imagining their return. You stop wondering what would happen if they suddenly came back and said everything you wanted to hear. And maybe that's the hardest part. You realize that even if they came back, the apology wouldn't give you back the time you lost. It wouldn't erase the nights you spent questioning yourself. It wouldn't undo the version of you that had to learn how to survive without answers. So why keep waiting? You don't need their apology to validate your pain. You don't need their regret to validate your growth. You don't need their understanding to validate your decision to leave. Let them misunderstand. Let them tell their story. Let them believe whatever helps them sleep at night. You have something better to do. You have a life to build that doesn't require their participation. And maybe the most beautiful kind of closure is not hearing the words, I'm sorry. Maybe it's reaching a morning where you realize you don't care whether those words ever come, because the person who once needed them has quietly become someone who can finally walk away without turning around. Someone who no longer needs the door to close from the other side, because you already decided to stop standing in the doorway, waiting for a person who chose not to walk through it. There comes a point where you realize the person you used to be is becoming impossible to recognize. Not because you became fake, not because you lost yourself, because you finally understood that the version of you that survived yesterday cannot be the same version responsible for building tomorrow. The old you had different rules. The old you tolerated things you would never tolerate now. The old you chased people who barely noticed your effort, explained yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, and accepted crumbs because you were afraid there might never be a full meal. Funny how fear can make a person call survival a lifestyle. You used to think strength meant holding on to people, holding on to memories, holding on to relationships that had already become empty rooms. You thought walking away meant losing, so you stayed. You stayed when your instincts were screaming. You stayed when your peace disappeared. You stayed because you were afraid that leaving would prove you weren't strong enough. But eventually you learned something almost insulting in its simplicity. Sometimes strength is knowing exactly when to stop. The old version of you needed everyone to understand. The new version understands that they don't have to. The old version needed approval before making a decision. The new version makes the decision and lets people form their own opinions. The old version reacted to every insult, every rejection, every betrayal. The new version watches, thinks, and chooses whether the situation even deserves a response. That's growth, not becoming louder, becoming harder to manipulate. Your new mindset isn't built on pretending you don't feel anything. That's not strength. That's emotional laziness disguised as toughness. You still feel anger. You still feel disappointment. You still get hurt. The difference is that your emotions no longer get to sit in the driver's seat while your future is tied to the roof. You can feel everything and still choose wisely. You can miss someone and still know they aren't good for you. You can forgive someone and still never give them access again. You can love someone and still walk away. The old you thought these things contradicted each other. The new you understands that boundaries don't cancel love. Distance doesn't always mean hatred. Silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes silence is simply what happens when you finally realize there is nothing left to explain. And here's where people become uncomfortable with your growth. They remember the version of you who was always available, always answering, always helping, always explaining, always giving another chance. So when you stop doing those things, they may call you cold. They may say you've changed. They may act like your boundaries are an attack. Of course you've changed. That was the point. You weren't supposed to go through all that pain and come out exactly the same. What would have been the lesson? You don't walk through fire and then complain that your clothes smell like smoke. Your scars are evidence that something happened, but they are not instructions telling you to remain the same person forever. Maybe you used to overthink every decision because you were terrified of making the wrong one. Now you understand that staying in the wrong place is also a decision. Maybe you used to chase certainty. Now you understand that sometimes courage means moving without guarantees. Maybe you used to wait for motivation. Now you understand discipline doesn't care whether you feel inspired. The new version of you doesn't need perfect conditions. They move anyway. They build anyway. They heal anyway. They say no anyway. They keep going even when nobody notices. And that's why the old version can't survive here. The old version needed constant reassurance. The new version has evidence. Evidence that you've survived things you thought would destroy you. Evidence that you can start again. Evidence that losing someone isn't the same thing as losing yourself. Evidence that being alone for a season can be healthier than being surrounded by people who drain your soul. You don't have to hate who you were. That person got you here. That person made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, ignored warning signs, and sometimes accepted less than they deserved. But that person also kept going when they had every reason to stop. Respect that version of yourself, then release it. Because you cannot build a new life while constantly obeying the rules created by an old version of you who was only trying to survive. And eventually you reach a point where survival is no longer the goal, where peace becomes the standard, discipline becomes the language, boundaries become normal, and the person you once were begins to feel less like your identity and more like someone you remember from a life you no longer need to return to. What exhausts people more than the pain itself? Fighting reality, not the event, not the person. Reality, the simple fact that something happened and no amount of anger, overthinking, replaying, or wishing can turn the clock backward. You can hate what happened every morning and every night, and yesterday will remain exactly where it is. Strange little game, isn't it? You keep fighting a battle that ended years ago, then wonder why you're still tired. Maybe you wanted a different ending. Of course you did. You wanted them to choose differently. You wanted the relationship to survive. You wanted the opportunity to work. You wanted the person you trusted to actually be worthy of your trust. You wanted the apology, the explanation, the justice, the version of the story where everything finally made sense. But life doesn't always hand you the ending you ordered. Sometimes it simply hands you a lesson and walks away. And that's where your real battle begins. Not with what happened, but with your refusal to accept that it happened. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. Remember that. Accepting reality doesn't mean saying, what they did was okay. It means saying, it happened, and I refuse to destroy myself trying to make it unhappen. That's different. That's powerful. You can acknowledge the damage without becoming permanently damaged by it. There are people who spend years arguing with memories. They replay conversations. They imagine different responses. They create alternate timelines in their minds where one sentence could have changed everything. And maybe it could have. Maybe it couldn't. You'll never know. That's the trap. The brain loves questions with no answers because it can keep asking them forever. What if I had noticed sooner? What if I had stayed? What if I had left earlier? What if they had changed? What if I had been better? Look at that last one. That's where pain becomes dangerous. You start turning someone else's decision into evidence against your own worth. You start believing that if you had been smarter, kinder, richer, stronger, more attractive, more patient, more understanding, maybe the outcome would have changed. Maybe. Or maybe they simply made the choice they were always going to make. You don't need to punish yourself for another person's behavior. Peace begins when you stop putting yourself on trial for things you couldn't control. And yes, some days you'll still be angry. That's human. Don't turn healing into another performance where you're expected to smile every morning and pretend nothing matters. You can have bad days. You can remember. You can feel the anger rise. The difference is that you don't build a house inside the emotion. You let it pass. You stop feeding it. You stop turning one painful chapter into the entire book. Because your mind will sometimes ask you to revisit the past under the illusion that you're solving something. But you're not solving it. You're reopening it. There is a difference. Solving means learning from it. Reopening means repeatedly touching the wound and asking why it still hurts. You already know why. It hurt because it mattered. Now let it become information instead of identity. Let betrayal teach you discernment without teaching you hatred. Let rejection teach you resilience without teaching you insecurity. Let failure teach you discipline without teaching you shame. Let loss teach you gratitude without convincing you that everything you love must eventually disappear. That's what peace looks like. Not forgetting the lesson. Carrying the lesson without carrying the weight. You don't have to forgive someone today. You don't even have to feel ready. But you do have to stop allowing their actions to dictate your next decade. That's too expensive. Your future is worth more than that. Think about how ridiculous it would be to let someone who hurt you years ago continue hurting you every morning simply because you keep replaying what they did. They may have moved on. They may not even remember the conversation that you have memorized word for word. Meanwhile, you're paying emotional rent in a building they don't even live in anymore. Leave. Not for them. For you. Stop demanding that the past become fair before you allow the present to become beautiful. Because sometimes fairness isn't getting back what you lost. Sometimes fairness is refusing to lose anything else. You lost time. Don't lose more. You lost trust. Don't lose your ability to trust yourself. You lost someone. Don't lose yourself trying to understand why they left. You experienced pain. Don't turn that pain into a permanent personality. At some point, you have to look at the ruins and stop asking why the building collapsed. You have to take whatever survived, clear the ground, and start building something different. Maybe the new structure won't look like the old one. Good. Maybe your new life won't resemble the life you thought you wanted. Good. Maybe the person you become wouldn't recognize the person you used to be. Good. That means something changed. And when you finally stop fighting what already happened, you stop wasting your strength on a door that only opens backward. Your energy becomes available again. Your attention returns. Your ambition starts breathing. You begin noticing opportunities that were invisible while you were busy staring at the wreckage. You realize peace was never waiting for the past to apologize. Peace was waiting for you to stop arguing with reality and start deciding what happens next. Because the past already took what it was going to take, and now the only thing left to protect is everything you haven't built yet. There is something almost ridiculous about the way the past works. It can be years behind you and still somehow convince your mind that it is happening right now. A conversation from 5 years ago can suddenly appear in your head while you're making coffee. A betrayal that ended long ago can still influence who you trust today. One person can hurt you once, and somehow you spend years letting that one moment interview everyone who comes after them. That's the trick. The past doesn't need to physically return to control you. It only needs you to keep giving it permission. And maybe you didn't realize you were doing it. Maybe you thought you were being careful. You told yourself you were protecting your heart. You said, "I'm never letting anyone do that to me again." Sounds strong, doesn't it? But sometimes the wall you build to keep pain out also keeps life out. You don't notice because the wall feels safe. Nothing gets through. No betrayal, no disappointment, no vulnerability, no real connection either. You survived the past. You're not supposed to live inside it. There's a difference between remembering what happened and obeying what happened. Remembering says, "I learned something." Obeying says, "Because that happened once, I will never allow myself to experience anything fully again." One creates wisdom. The other creates a prison with very comfortable excuses. You don't need to forget what people did. In fact, forgetting the lesson would be foolish. But you don't need to make every new person pay the emotional bill for someone else's behavior. Not everyone is the person who hurt you. Not every opportunity is the opportunity you lost. Not every goodbye means abandonment. Not every disagreement is the beginning of betrayal. Sometimes your past teaches you patterns, but you decide whether those patterns become predictions. That's where maturity begins. You stop saying, "This will happen again," and start saying, "If something happens again, I'll know how to handle it." Feel the difference. The first statement is fear pretending to be wisdom. The second is confidence. You don't need a guarantee that nobody will ever hurt you again. Nobody can give you that. You need confidence that if life hurts you again, you won't lose yourself trying to survive it. That's a completely different kind of strength. You can enter a new relationship without dragging 10 old relationships into the room. You can take a new opportunity without assuming the last failure is waiting around the corner. You can trust someone carefully without interrogating every innocent action because somebody else once lied to you. Your past can sit in the back seat. It doesn't get to drive, and yes, there will be moments when it tries. You'll hear something familiar. You'll notice a behavior that reminds you of an old situation. Your mind will immediately scream, "Here we go again." But pause. Not every familiar feeling is a warning. Sometimes it's just a memory. You don't have to react before reality gives you a reason. That's one of the hardest lessons to learn because pain trains you to move quickly. Pain wants certainty. It wants you to identify the threat before the threat actually exists. It tells you that if you assume the worst first, you'll never be surprised again. But that's not living. That's constant surveillance of your own life. You become so focused on preventing the next heartbreak that you forget to experience the present moment. You start questioning good things because they feel too good. You start expecting people to leave because someone once did. You sabotage opportunities because failure is familiar. You reject peace because chaos is what you understand. And then you wonder why life feels empty. You can't build a peaceful future using rules created during your most painful season. Some rules were necessary then. They aren't necessary now. The version of you who had no boundaries needed protection. The version of you who now has boundaries doesn't need walls around everything. The version of you who once trusted blindly needed discernment. The version of you who now understands people doesn't need to suspect everyone. That's growth. You don't erase the past. You upgrade your relationship with it. You can look back and say, "That happened to me," but it doesn't decide what happens next. That sentence alone can change everything. Because your future hasn't happened yet. Think about that. The past is finished. The future is unwritten. And somehow people spend most of their energy letting the finished part control the unfinished part. Don't do that. You have no reason to give yesterday voting rights over tomorrow. Let the lesson stay. Let the fear leave. Let the scar remain without turning it into a map. You can be cautious without being closed. You can be wise without being cynical. You can remember without reliving. You can forgive without reconnecting. You can move forward without pretending the past never happened. And perhaps the strangest part is that one day you'll realize the past didn't disappear. You simply stopped carrying it everywhere. The memories are still there. The names are still there. The lessons are still there. But they no longer decide who you trust, where you go, what you attempt, or how deeply you allow yourself to live. That's when you know you've changed. Not when you forget the pain. When the pain stops writing your decisions. You stop asking, "What if it happens again?" You start asking, "What do I want now?" You stop building your life around avoiding the worst thing that could happen. You start building it around the best thing that could happen. And suddenly, the future feels less like a threat and more like an empty page, waiting for a version of you who finally understands that yesterday can keep its memories, its mistakes, its scars, and its ghosts, but it doesn't get your hands on the steering wheel anymore, because the road ahead belongs to the person you are becoming, and not the person you had to be just to survive what came before.